With this, I'm inviting Jala team.
Hello, everyone, and thank you, Venkata, for your introduction. As a Day Soda alum, I know how important the arts are, so good work on that. My name is Kevin Luhrs, and I'm working on the Jacksonville Area Legal Aid Project. However, I'd like to turn your attention to Christian, a hypothetical tenant who resembles many of Jala's clients. So Christian is a veteran without a bachelor's degree. He lives paycheck to paycheck working for a transportation company, and after years of dignified employment, is laid off from his job. He starts his job search, and unfortunately, the median job search takes about 9 weeks. He misses rent, and his landlord files an eviction notice against him. So with the eviction and changes the locks on his door. In Florida, this is illegal. And in Duval County, you have 5 days to respond to an eviction notice before a default judgment is rendered against you. If you can find legal representation within that time, and if Christian does, he has a very good chance of winning his case because changing the locks on the door is illegal. If you cannot find legal representation within that time, unfortunately, the chances of Christian staying in his apartment decline significantly. Christian's story is not unique. It happens to millions of people across the United States and many in Duval County. These stories, this intuition has filled our literature review, our statistical modeling, just as Dr. Polson said, that the data supplementing the intuition for public policymakers, for us, that intuition supplements our data, which leads us into the literature review. So we conducted a comprehensive literature review on the literature on evictions. And we find that housing instability is a causal predictor of poverty and chronic unemployment. Furthermore, it's also associated with a range of undesirable health outcomes, health and social outcomes. Among these, evicted mothers report higher levels of material hardship, depression, and stress compared to stably housed mothers. Furthermore, there is an increased risk of death in the next year for those who are evicted, and it's associated with moves to higher crime and more impoverished neighborhoods. Furthermore, it also makes it more difficult to find housing of comparable quality when you have an eviction notice filed against you, which forces many tenants to accept substandard housing. This leads us into, apologies about that. Anyway, the housing demand, that in Duval County, there's been an increase in housing demand, and it's exploded in the recent years. So that has caused rents to increase, that has caused the number of rent-burdened residents to increase significantly, and this has also made it an attractive market for large corporate landlords who we know through our literature review tend to have arm's-length relationships with tenants and also have a formalized eviction process, which increases the eviction risk, which this enters Jala. Jala is an organization providing high-quality legal services to special needs and low-income groups across 17 northeastern Florida counties. They were founded in 1937 during the Great Depression, and their goal is to further economic and social justice within Northeast Florida. Furthermore, to highlight some of their work, they had 10,000 requests for legal services in 2023 and provided over $1 million in-kind legal services to the impoverished and low-income residents of Duval County and the surrounding counties. With many legal aid organizations, unfortunately, they find it very difficult to identify people proactively. They're in a state of reaction. They wait for people to reach out to them. To that end, they did reach out to us, Florida Data Science for Social Good, to deliver a system that would proactively identify clients as they arise. Unfortunately, we were not able to get there, but I'm proud to say that we have conducted a comprehensive research project where we looked at the eviction data in Duval County, and we were able to identify trends and patterns in that data, which will help inform their efforts. And in addition, we'll also document next steps for them to be able to get to that predictive system. I'd also like to invite, with that said, I'd like to invite my colleague Lissa onto the stage to talk more about our methodology. Thank you.
Thank you, Kevin. So our methodology analyzes eviction risks and helps to target cases that are most vulnerable. I'll walk you through the 4 key components of our approach. So we based our approach on the proven methodologies that were developed by the Princeton Eviction Lab. With their findings, we were able to determine that demographics and socioeconomic factors play a big role in evictions across the country. Next, we analyzed the eviction records from the clerk of court alongside the demographic and socioeconomic factors from the census blocks. This allowed us to deeply understand the eviction landscape in Duval County. In statistical modeling phase, we employed clustering methods to group those census blocks that had similar characteristics and helped us to identify high-risk neighborhoods. We also used logistic regression to explore the relationship between these factors. Finally, we developed a case prioritization framework. This framework gives a likelihood for the case evictions, and with the likelihood we were able to determine and quickly identify and prioritize those cases that are most significant and that would most benefit from legal intervention. So we came across several challenges, but the most significant was attempting to classify wrongful eviction. Now, most of you might be wondering what a wrongful eviction is. So let me take you back on Christian's story. If Christian's landlord decided to perhaps change the door locks without any legal processes, or maybe tried to forcefully chase Christian from his apartment without any proper notice, that would be a wrongful eviction. But unfortunately, due to the lack of detailed data, we were not able to achieve this goal. However, we shifted our focus into identifying potential cases. So with the clerk of court, it was challenging due to its inconsistencies with missing entries and different formatting, which made it a bit challenging for us to work with. And due to the tenants' diversity in demographics and socioeconomic factors, it was also difficult for us to create groups for these cases. Now I'll dive deep into the clerk of court. First, the clerk of court is basically just the court data. So we start with a weekly file, which has eviction cases received from the clerk of court. These eviction cases have had an activity within that week. And by an activity, it could either be a hearing or a motion has been filed and so on. This data had 2 parties, which was later on split into those 2 parties. So we started with the defendants, where we standardized the addresses using geocodio. Then we incorporated the census information based on the census blocks that the address is in. And after that, we analyzed the data to identify trends, frequencies, and geographic distribution. We moved to the plaintiffs, where we used feature engineering to quantify the landlord and attorney filings. So this helped us a lot, as it helped us to identify and observe those key attorney-landlord relations. Then later on, we remerged these 2 data into a single file, which was known as the master file. So this master file is the one that was used to perform statistical modeling. Now, something that was of most importance to JALA was to identify those attorneys that had the highest filings within a week. Now, looking at this visual, we see that we have typical attorneys, which it was an average of, all these typical attorneys had an average of 2 cases filed, while we had the high filers who had 11 cases filed. Now, what does this tell us? This revealed that there are some attorneys that would have high mass filings within a week, and that means they would have less concentration for each of these cases. So this information was insightful for our analysis, as it helped us to identify those cases in which tenants could have a high risk of being evicted. I would like to turn this to Devan, who's going to dive deep into statistical modeling.
Thank you, Lisa. So once we got our data set and our data file all merged together, we wanted to move on to our statistical modeling. But like Lisa mentioned, before we could move on to any modeling, we needed to incorporate census data. This includes demographic and socioeconomic factors that closely aligned with the Princeton Eviction Lab research that we did. Once we incorporated that census block data, we could then move on to clustering to better identify those neighborhoods where evictions are filed that JALA might benefit with reaching out to. Our first step was initial clustering, making sure that we could identify these key factors, and then we wanted to take it a step further and move on with more refined layers or refined clustering. Once we developed our clusters, we pursued a logistic regression analysis to really understand the relationship that these features had with one another. Now, before we move on, what exactly is clustering? Clustering analysis is a method taking place to group features together to better understand where these feature groups lay within the data. So let's go into the clusters that we were able to find. So we took our master file, and we noticed with our initial clustering layer that there were two prominent groups that came out of that. There were neighborhoods with high veteran populations and neighborhood with high low-income populations. But this didn't really scratch that itch that we had. We wanted to be able to identify further clusters that JALA could actually reach out to and help with their eviction. So we did an additional layer of clustering to dive deeper. Within the high veteran neighborhoods, we found that there is a real delimitation between age. So we have clusters with young, middle-aged, and older median ages within those clusters. And you can see here that in that top cluster, there's a young, more educated, and a high attorney involvement. Now, when we're looking at these clusters, what does attorney involvement mean? This relates back to what Lisa was mentioning, with identifying attorneys that have a high caseload per week. A high caseload can be synonymous with an attorney that might not be able to pay as close attention as, say, a low filing attorney. You might also see in these clusters there's a high legal involvement. This relates back to a landlord count and as well as an attorney count. Really identifying the relationships between landlords and attorneys in Duval County, it helps us identify cases that would satisfy with JALA assistance. Now, being able to identify those within the high veterans neighborhoods was important, but it's also important to identify clusters within these low income neighborhoods. So you can see that there's also a delimitation upon age. And you can also see that there is a delimitation on legal involvement as well. Knowing that these clusters exist and knowing the relationship between these features within these clusters, it helped us develop a way to prioritize these cases. So where evictions might be in a high veteran neighborhood where the population is older or less educated with minimal legal involvement, that might be the perfect case for JALA to reach out to. This leads us to our recommendations to JALA. As was mentioned, we weren't able to specifically identify wrongful evictions. So one step moving forward is to add this to their case management system. This allows JALA to actually identify those evictions that are wrongful. It provides the framework for future projects as well as JALA to build upon. Once you understand what a wrongful eviction is, you can develop foundation around that to reach and expand on the client's met. We also would recommend that JALA aligns their intake to incorporate and collect more census-related information. Through our extensive research, we found that there were socioeconomic and demographic factors that JALA could benefit in collecting throughout their intake process. This, along with collecting wrongful evictions, will really lay the foundation for JALA and future DSSG projects to grow on. Next is incorporating and improving upon eviction data reporting with the clerk of court. We are very grateful for the data that we receive from the clerk of court, and it's not perfect, but no data source is. So working with JALA and the clerk of court to really make sure that the eviction reports that they receive is beneficial to not only them, but the tenants in the Duval County area is helpful for every party involved. And finally, JALA is one of the few legal aids across the country that actually has an in-house data scientist. So if they can take the information that we were able to gather and the recommendations that we were able to suggest, they can adapt and refine this approach. Being able to adapt this approach and making sure that it works for JALA is imperative for helping future tenants. Thank you.